But first, why are we actually here? To really state it succinctly, is that the advancing threats to humanity outpace the intensity and scale of behavioral response. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is that we have melting ice sheets in the Arctic. We have a destabilized financial system that's causing widespread hardship. Right? We have natural disasters, flooding, tsunamis, earthquakes, volcanoes, tornadoes, all these things that are happening around us that are making it hard for us to live our lives. And we have these really weird problems of abundance and scarcity. Some people have incredible wealth, and yet so many people don't have enough. And at the same time, we're in the midst of a period where we no longer have an abundance of natural resources. We're running out of oil. We're running out of precious metals. We're running out of potable water. And so in this period where all these really big things, this kind of cluster of threats that create this huge existential quandary for humanity, and our behavioral response is not happening big enough or fast enough to respond to that change. And that's why we're here today, is to start to really address that big picture. So to help give this a little bit of a temporal context, let's look. This is mostly US cultural history, but I think it maps onto the world fairly well. There was this time back in the 60s when it seemed like things might be going a little differently. There was a lot of awakening of consciousness for people. They were talking about peace instead of war, bringing down empire. They were talking about love and compassion. And then we had some people in our political space, some leaders who were starting to advance a more progressive notion of the world. The EPA was created. We have these institutions starting to get set up. Looks like we might be making progress. And then, what happened? Then we had this turnover where the culture started to shift in a different direction. And we started to have people who were opposed, very structurally, strategically, almost militaristically opposed to this kind of a shift in the culture. And they reversed it in some ways. They took us to another place. And we had this progression of political leaders and business leaders who were taking us somewhere other than addressing the deep threats that 60s generation was really starting to shed light on. And that's led us to a point where now we have this huge mix of problems, and we're not responding to them on the appropriate scale. And sure, we have this networked world that is being created that creates some new possibilities for us, but we haven't unleashed the power and potential of that creativity to turn the culture back in the right direction again. And I think there are a lot of things moving us in that direction, but that's what we're trying to do is, in our conversation today, is talk about how do we get that big cultural shift, consciousness shift, realignment of norms and values. So what didn't we see when we started this march toward progress 50 years ago? Well, we didn't see the corporatization of America. We didn't see how powerful that would be. We didn't see that there would be these incredibly powerful propaganda, communication systems that would set a specific agenda and largely influence the way people see the world. And we didn't see astroturfing and sophisticated ways of engaging people around real concerns with fictitious threats to mobilize them against change. All of that has happened, and there's something else we didn't see. Is we didn't see this tremendous investment in an infrastructure for opposing what we're trying to do. Now this network map right here shows basically two colors. The blue is all of the liberal think tanks in the United States, and the red is all of the conservative think tanks in the United States as of a few years ago. I think 2006 is when they made this. So what this shows is that over the last 40 to 50 years, there has been a strategic, substantive, very large investment in a communication system that is directly opposed to us. That is directly opposed to equality, fairness, justice, sustainability. And so it's not that we just were moving along and we made some mistakes. We actually had some forces pushing very strongly against us. And we're going to have to be able to push back against them effectively as we move forward. So this gets back to that big question. How do we design for large-scale change? turns out the ancient mystics and the wisdom of the ages has an answer for us. The answer lies within. Turns out they were right. That's true. The answer lies within, by which I mean that if we understand what it means to be human, we can use that understanding to design change processes that actually appeal to humans and then help create change that creates thriving in human community. So if we look within ourselves, we can reveal that blind spot, and we can see what's there, and then we can design for change more effectively. So one of the big problems that we've had in designing for change is that we've had this, what I call an assumed human nature, which is this idea that we're calculating machines who weigh the pros and cons in every choice, try and get the maximal outcome, just like we're calculators. Now, this is a nice theory for mathematicians looking at economics back in the 1940s. But I like to call it the assumed theory of human nature because it's not really how we work. The way that human beings work is something a little different. And so, a really exciting thing, and this is something that inspires me a lot, is for the first time ever in human history, we now are starting to really understand what human nature is. So in the last 40 years, there's been a revolution happening in academia, studying how the mind works and what human nature is. It comes from fields like evolutionary psychology or neuroscience or linguistics. This huge body of knowledge that's been developed that's telling us a different view of what human nature is. And it's scientific, which means that we have methods for critiquing, improving, falsifying, so we know whether we're right or not. And so this is something that's been developing for quite some time, but it's not really trickled its way into society yet. It's starting to. But that's a really inspiring and hopeful idea, that we actually are starting to really understand what it means to be human. Quite an accomplishment for us. So what we're learning about what it means to be human is what's sometimes called the embodied mind. And the embodied mind is a notion that the way that human beings work is partially a matter of our ecological history, our physical and biological nature, the cultural as well as built environments around us that all shape who we are and how we work. So I like to think of it as the kinds of brains we have, the kinds of bodies we have, and the kinds of environments we find ourselves in, both physical and cultural, shape the kinds of minds that we have. At the same time, we've learned things like we're wired for empathy, that we have really powerful ways of believing things about the world rather than simply reasoning about them. But at the same time, we have an incredible capacity for reason and logic. So we have these aspects of who we are that are really interesting, that are a lot more than just being a calculator. We also have a tribal nature. We have this way of wanting to be in group with others. So these things that we're learning about how we work, and I think of them as kind of liberating, they're empowering. If we understand what it means to be tribal, yes, that can be divisive and make people into different groups, but it can also mean that we can be inclusive and we can work together and collaborate. So it's part of who we are. So this idea of embodiment is really important, and everything that we talk about today regarding the mind, it's important to keep in mind that we can ground it back in our brains and our bodies and our communities. It's not just this abstract, the mind is out there doing its thing. It's embedded, it's ecological. So that's pretty cool. And to give you a sense of what I mean, let's go through a couple examples of some things that we've been learning about the mind. And I don't know if you've ever gotten this email. I loved it when I first got it. But if you can read English, you can make sense of this paragraph, even though the letters within the words are all mixed up. And this tells us something really important about how our minds work. It tells us that our minds are set up to see patterns in the world that are familiar to us and to fill in information in a way that helps us to understand what's happening in those situations. So my ability to process language lets me see the kind of gestalt or the bigger pattern of the sentence structure through the words and the spacing in the words. And then I'm able to make sense of it. And my brain is filling in that information for me. And I kind of get it for free. I don't have to do any active work. My brain just does it. So our brains do this pattern matching process, which is really useful to know about. Now another one, I should say I love animals. I really love elephants. And I especially love levitating elephants. If you look at this optical illusion, you'll see that the legs actually don't connect to the body. And this is kind of a fun little thing, but one of the things this tells us is that our brains don't just do pattern matching, they also do pattern completion. They will fill in patterns, but they don't just fill them in any old way. They fill them in a way that makes things meaningful. They create these gestalt understandings. So when you're looking at the top of the elephant, your brain is trying to make the legs attached. When you're looking at the bottom of the elephant, it's trying to shift the body over onto the legs. So your brain is completing the information for you in ways that are meaningful and useful. And so it's not just that we see the world as it is, we see the world as it is meaningful to us. And that our brains just do this for us, which is pretty cool. Now, this is another one you might have seen. If you look at the black part, it looks like a vase. If you look at the white part, it looks like faces. This actually tells us something incredibly important about how our brains work. It's this phenomenon called mutual inhibition. What that is when your brain is creating a pattern, which is, the neurons are firing into this pattern structure, which is the information that represents the idea. When it's forming that pattern, if there's a different pattern that contradicts it, that makes it confusing, there's a part of your brain that shuts down those circuits. And that's called mutual inhibition. For one circuit to be active, the other must be inhibited. Now, to really understand this with example, think about what happens when a person is having an epileptic seizure. Their brain is just having random firing all over the place, and what it does is it shuts down consciousness and they pass out. So it tells us is that our brains need to have the ability to regulate themselves to create coherence. And to do that, they have to inhibit one idea to create another. Yeah?
Is this the same or different from the idea of cognitive dissonance?
Cognitive dissonance is, I would maybe say it's a higher level phenomenon that includes this. For there to be cognitive dissonance, you have to have two ideas that are kind of battling it out for which one is going to get dominance. But that process of mutual inhibition is why that happens. And I think it's helpful to think about it from an information processing perspective, because then you can understand why is there dissonance. There's dissonance because for this to make sense and this to be there at the same time, that doesn't work. So if this is different from that, I have to suppress one to have the other one be active. That's the information processing point.